Establishing central influence and preparing a flexible development are key benefits. Establishing central pawns creates immediate tension and opens possibilities for piece development. Challenging the center immediately, this move carves out a dynamic battle for board control. Solidifying the center, this unlocks the dark-squared bishop for development while respecting white's central initiative. Developing the knight to its natural square, nc3, reinforces central influence and prepares for further pawn advances. Preparing for castling, the bishop finds a natural square, eyeing the queenside and reinforcing the pawn structure. Developing knights towards the center is a fundamental principle, preparing for pawn breaks and controlling key squares. Developing the knight to its most natural square, the knight now supports the central pawns and prepares for castling, while also eyeing squares like e4 and d3 for potential counterplay. Pinning the knight immediately creates immediate tactical tension and restricts black's development options on the kingside. Securing the monarch immediately addresses potential kingside weaknesses, preparing for queenside counterplay. Bolstering the central pawn structure, white aims for a solid setup, anticipating eventual pawn breaks without committing prematurely. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance creates a slight weakness but aims to disrupt white's developing harmony. Sacrificing piece activity for a cleaner pawn structure opens lines for your rooks, potentially targeting the king's exposed position. Reclaiming the bishop with bxf6 solidifies the pawn structure, accepting a slightly less active king's side, but potentially creating a central pawn majority later. Initiating pressure on the open c-file, preparing a central pawn push and potential queenside expansion. Solidifying the pawn structure aims to prevent white's central pressure and prepare for b6. Preparing the bishop's diagonal control and eyeing dark squares, this gently repositions for central influence. Developing the knight to d7 aims to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential queenside expansion. Castling secures the king, preparing for potential central pawn advances and offering a clearer path for the rooks to join the fray along the open files. Capturing that pawn relinquishes central space and offers white a central pawn majority, simplifying the early game. Regaining the pawn maintains white's central pawn structure, preparing to contest the open c-file. Securing the bishop's diagonal and preparing to fianchetto, this pawn push strategically expands black's queenside influence. This pawn thrust aggressively seizes central space, aiming to restrict black's knight and bishop development further. A solidifying maneuver, the bishop now eyes the important c4 square, aiming to disrupt white's central control. The pawn aggressively advances, seizing crucial central space and restricting black's queenside development. Recentering the bishop to defend the kingside structure and prepare for potential central action. Focusing the queen on the kingside pawn's advance, preparing to push the e-pawn further and potentially trap the black bishop. Challenging the bishop's diagonal advance, black boldly expands on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's central grip and gain counterplay. Repositioning the bishop to d3 fortifies the kingside and prepares a potential kingside attack, subtly anchoring white's pieces for future action. Sacrificing pawn structure for queenside expansion, black aims to disrupt white's central influence and open new lines of attack. Sacrificing a knight for pawn material often signals a radical shift, aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and seize the initiative. Opening the c-file now, you embrace a sharp tactical battle for central control and piece activity. Securing the bishop's diagonal is paramount, and this repositions it to a more active square, potentially aiming for kingside pressure. Sacrificing the bishop to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay is a bold, albeit risky, decision. Reclaiming the central square, the white queen exerts pressure, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Unleashing the queen to pressure the d4 pawn and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure creates dynamic counterplay. Targeting the queen and disrupting black's coordination opens lines for white's pieces. Initiating a central counterattack, this knight repositions aggressively to pressure white's advanced pawn structure and disrupt their coordination. Repositioning the queen here might be aiming to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps to support a d-pawn push or defend against black's queenside pressure. Initiating a counterstrike on the queenside, this advance pressures white's rook and aims to disrupt their pawn structure. Reclaiming the open c-file with the rook aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and prepare a potential infiltration. Challenging white's advanced pawn, this maneuver aims to disrupt the queen's current dominance and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Concentrating forces on the open c-file finally exerts pressure against black's queenside pawn structure. Unlocking the d-file pressure is key now. The rook aims to exploit weaknesses, prophylactically securing the kingside pawn structure, preventing any immediate black advances or piece infiltrations. The rook infiltrates, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and exert pressure on the open file. Reinforcing the central control and preparing to challenge the open file with doubled rooks. Retreating the bishop to f8 aims to secure the king, anticipating potential pressure on the dark squares but surrendering the crucial diagonal. Asserting control over the third rank, this rook aims to restrict black's pieces and prepare for future advances. Securing the rook on an open file, the black king's defender eyes potential breakthroughs. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, this ambitious advance seeks to shatter black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Sacrificing a pawn to open a diagonal for the bishop, aiming for aggressive counterplay on the queenside. Unlocking the open file for the rook, a decisive moment for asserting pressure along the c-file. Initiating a knight, repositioning towards the queenside's open files to contest control. Injecting a knight into a critical central square, this move disrupts black's pawn structure and opens up attacking avenues. Asserting control over the queenside network, this knight solidifies black's strategic foothold. Sacrificing pawn territory here aims to destabilize black's pawn chain and potentially open a path for the rook. Unleashing a surprise check, black disrupts white's queenside ambitions and forces immediate defensive reassessment. Securing the king's escape route is paramount after the forcing checks, preventing immediate tactical issues. Threatening to unravel white's queenside pawn structure with the queen and rook battery. Securing the attacked rook frees up options for controlling the central files. The knight repositions for an assault on the queenside, eyeing potential outposts while also reinforcing the central pawn structure. Steering the rook to the active fourth rank now seeks to control central squares and potentially prepare a kingside attack. Exchanges the queen, simplifying into a potentially favorable endgame for black due to piece activity. Consolidating queenside pressure by repositioning the rook establishes a formidable presence on the open file. The rook's redeployment to the first rank secures the d-file for potential future incursions, setting up endgame pressure. Unlocking the file for your rook allows immediate pressure against black's queen and potential tactical ideas. Reigniting centralized pressure, the knight aggressively occupies the d5 outpost, threatening significant disruption. Exchanging this rook simplifies the position and seeks a favorable endgame with your active knights. The rook's capture creates an endgame where white holds a slight material advantage. Securing the rook's new outpost strengthens white's queenside and prepares for a potential rook lift. Bringing the rook to the open file now exerts pressure, aiming to exploit weaknesses on the queenside. Expanding the queenside pawn chain now aims to create a strong passed pawn and restrict black's rooks. Unleashing the bishop from its pawn shield grants it newfound reach towards white's vulnerable queenside pawn structure. Solidifying the kingside structure, this move prepares to reinforce the central pawn chain and potentially launch a queenside attack. The pawn push on g5 aims to gain space and potentially create attacking chances, but it weakens the kingside structure for future skirmishes. Shifting the monarch to a safer square on g2 reinforces the king's position against any immediate threats. Releasing the king from its protective pawn shield is a dangerous gamble given the open files, potentially inviting further complications. Reactivating the knight to challenge the open files and pressure black's isolated pawns offers a dynamic shift. Repositioning the bishop to the b6 square conserves its long-range influence and eyes the advanced white pawns. Reinforcing the rook's position on the second rank prepares for potential endgame battles and centralizes the defense. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers renewed pressure and aims to exploit the pinned knight's predicament. Pivoting the knight aggressively to c4 aims to disrupt black's connected passed pawn potential on the queen side. Repositioning the bishop to c5 activates a passive piece and prepares to contest the c-file after the rook redeploys. Targeting the weak c5 square with the knight, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create breakthroughs. Re-establishing the bishop's outposted position aims to support the pawn chain and pressure the d-pawn. Consolidating pieces for a potential pawn push forward to gain space and control. Awaiting king's safety reassessment as the bishop retreats to a potentially vulnerable outpost. Activating the knight to d8 immediately prepares for its potential leap to c6 to menace the isolated rook. Sacrificing the bishop offers a glimmer of hope for complications by opening the rook's path. Repositioning the rook to the second rank aims to reinforce the central squares and prepare for potential kingside advances. Clearing the defender from the d4 square is a bold decision, opening tactical lines but potentially leaving the e5 pawn exposed. Unleashing a powerful knight sortie, white aims to shatter black's defensive structure and exploit exposed pieces. Exchanging this bishop simplifies the position, potentially leading to an endgame where white's passed pawn might become a significant threat. Seizing the opportunity, white eliminates a troublesome pawn, simplifying towards a slightly advantageous material count. Activating the rook to the open central file aims to create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king in the endgame. The rook boldly advances, aiming to infiltrate the 7th rank and exploit the exposed black king. Pushing the h-pawn aims to create counterplay, but it weakens the king's pawn shield dangerously. Aimed at the pinned knight, this conserves the rook's attacking potential on the open file, preventing immediate counterplay. King activation is the priority, bringing the monarch towards the center to aid the remaining pieces in a challenging endgame. Unleashing the rook along the back rank now creates immediate threats to the exposed black king and forces further defensive concessions. Unleashing the pawn's potential creates a crucial passed danger, forcing white to react defensively. Unleashing a check that forces the black king out into the open battlefield. The black king, now exposed on the dark squares, faces imminent danger as white's rook infiltrates the 7th rank. Centralizing the knight here shores up the king's defenses and prepares for a counterattack. Opening the kingside for black's rook to potentially infiltrate, though it leaves the monarch somewhat exposed. Seizing the opportunity, the white king ventures forward, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares and activate its own pieces in the endgame. Regaining the pawn offers material parity, but surrenders the crucial kingside space advantage white had painstakingly built. Unleashing a final check, this king hunt intensifies, seeking to exploit the exposed monarch. Protecting the monarch from the looming threat on the kingside becomes paramount now. Snatching the pawn now opens lines and creates an immediate pawn majority threat. The black king, now exposed, drifts further from safety as white's rook advances into the endgame. Targeting the exposed black king on the kingside by repositioning the rook to the 7th rank presents a new avenue for attack. Consolidating the rook to a more active file offers better defensive and offensive possibilities. Opening up lines for the rook to become more active is the primary goal here. Relocating the king to its back rank is a prudent defensive measure, anticipating any potential future threats along open files. Shifting the pawn structure to potentially support a breakthrough on the kingside offers new attacking avenues. The king finally seeks refuge, escaping the immediate threats but leaving its pawns exposed to the advancing knight. Opening the kingside and offering the Ra7 rook provides a much-needed attacking tempo. Shifting the king back to a more central defensive posture is crucial for surviving this endgame pressure. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure solidifies white's defense, preparing for a potential endgame advantage should the opportunity arise. The king's sudden foray into the center on e5 desperately tries to ignite activity, but it leaves its monarch exposed to attack. A shrewd repositioning, the rook now secures the 7th rank and eyes black's unsupported queen. Desperate times call for desperate measures as the black king scrambles for safety. Securing the king by stepping away from the action is a sound defensive maneuver. Re-establishing a knight outpost on f4 offers crucial defensive support for the king and potential counterplay. Liberating the rook from its pawn shield opens up an immediate attack on the knight. A desperate check, hoping to disrupt white's mating net and perhaps force a repetition or snag an undefended pawn. Securing the king behind its pawns provides essential safety for the final push. The knight's retreat allows white to consolidate and prepare a decisive pawn push. Initiating a decisive kingside attack, this forces a critical decision for black's monarch. A valiant defense, this knight aims to disrupt white's looming pawn storm and create counterplay. Trading rooks simplifies to a winning king and pawn endgame for white. The king now faces an exposed journey, desperately seeking sanctuary as the decisive exchange simplifies the board. Securing the king's escape route on the kingside opens up possibilities for white's remaining pieces to become more active. Relocating the monarch to square g6 marshals protection while eyeing potential endgame advancements. Shifting the king to the queenside aims to escort a passed pawn, but leaves it exposed to discovered attacks. The knight repositions, eyeing the weak kingside pawns and preparing to support a potential passed pawn push. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost now disrupts black's pawn structure and threatens discovery. Seeking to disrupt white's knights and create counterplay, black repositions the knight, eyeing potential tactics in the center. The king ventures out, aiming to support the queenside pawns and potentially create mating threats against black's isolated pieces. Snatching a pawn with a knight's fork forces the king to a more exposed square, creating a decisive tactical opportunity. Snaring the knight with the king forces a material advantage, simplifying the path to victory. A desperate maneuver to force a draw by repetition, though the knight's outpost offers little hope. Retreating the king to safety offers a respite, but the knight now eyes a central post. The knight's perpetual check dance continues, a desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable coronation of white's monarch. King's safety is paramount. Repositioning the monarch avoids further checks and prepares for pawn advances. A desperate attempt to force a draw through repetition, a clear sign of black's disadvantage. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square often dictates the rhythm of the endgame. The knight reclaims its central square, eyeing the weak pawns and preparing to support any advances. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to threaten black's weak pawns and exploit the open lines. The knight's foray now eyes the f4 pawn, a subtle attempt to inject life into the stagnant position. Securing the knight's advanced post disrupts black's coordination and prepares a decisive pawn push. Seeking a stable outpost for the knight on the kingside, perhaps targeting the g4 pawn is the aim here. Unleashing the knight to its most active square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and control key central squares. Reactivating the knight to the center aims to prevent white's knight from dominating the dark squares and potentially seeking a skewer. Opening a path for the knight to outflank the enemy pawns, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup. The king bravely marches forward, seeking active participation in the skirmish. The knight returns to a central outpost, eyeing potential forks and improving its defensive posture. The king makes a brave dash, seeking safety in the center's chaos. Activating the f-pawn to seize more central space and prepare for a potential breakthrough. Injecting the knight into the king's vicinity offers a spark of activity, but it likely won't be enough to alter the inevitable material loss. Opening up the king for a potential chase, white initiates a critical endgame maneuver. The knight repositions to contest the critical central square, preparing to defend or launch a counterattack. Pushing the pawn forces the king to move, opening avenues for the knight and creating mating threats. Kings march for activity, seeking central influence and potential pawn breakthroughs, opening a new path for the knight to infiltrate black's weakened kingside. Seizing the open file with the knight offers a dynamic pawn sacrifice for activity. Securing the king by repositioning for defensive or attacking potential. A strategic repositioning, aiming to bolster the monarch's safety by seeking the king's pawn shield. Activating the knight to a central outpost is key to maintaining pressure. A desperate attempt to reignite attack, but the king remains exposed to white's advancing pawns. Activating the knight to a superior outpost will restrict black's king's breathing room. Shifting the knight to c5 prepares to contest the central squares and potentially attack the white king's pawn structure. A delightful discovered check that forces a retreat and simplifies the position, pushing towards a favorable rook endgame. Sensing the potential for an attack on the king, black initiates a maneuver to redeploy their knight. Pushing the king forward seeks to activate it in this quiet endgame while avoiding any immediate threats. Securing the knight on d3 creates a formidable outpost, challenging white's control of the central squares and preventing immediate pawn advances. This knight repositions to the edge, aiming to create a passed pawn by forcing the black knight to abandon its defense of the d-pawn.